1327 BC, ancient Egypt is in mourning. In the Valley of the Kings, craftsmen scurry to prepare a makeshift tomb. Barely 19 years old, the pharaoh Tutankhamun is dead. His tomb is borrowed. Only 4 small rooms, it's tiny by royal standards. But its contents are fit for a king. A throne bearing a portrait of the young king and his wife is sheathed in gold. While his coffin, the innermost one of 3, is cast in solid gold and weighs over a ton. The mask that covered the face of his mummy is considered one of the most beautiful works of art ever crafted in the precious metal. The treasures of Tutankhamun's tomb, the only one discovered intact in the Valley of the Kings, are only a glimmer of what ancient Egypt must have been like during its fabulous Age of Gold. For over 400 years, Egypt's pharaohs were laid to rest in the Valley of the Kings. Their tombs were carved out of solid rock, but the burial chamber was called the House of Gold. Because of its warm glow and indestructibility, gold was thought to be the flesh of the sun god Ra and contain supernatural powers. The pharaoh was the offspring of the sun, a living god. By lavishing him with gold, the flesh of the gods, the Egyptians believed the pharaoh was assured an eternal life. But it was not to be. Filled with treasure beyond the imagination, most of their tombs would be opened in antiquity and their mummies removed. Lying in state in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo are the remains of some of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs: Thutmose I, Thutmose II, Thutmose IV, Seti I, and Ramesses the Great. But Tutankhamun's tiny tomb, along with his name, was lost and virtually forgotten. When the tomb was finally uncovered in 1922, the most stunning archaeological find of all time made Tutankhamun the most famous name in Egyptian history. His treasures bore witness to the astonishing riches and power of Egyptian civilization during the Age of Gold. Envied for its wealth, Egypt was blessed with a seemingly inexhaustible supply of gold. Mined from the deserts east of the Nile Valley, and especially from Nubia, now the Sudan, it was virtually common as dust. I cast statues of the gods in gold and electrum, decorated with lapis lazuli and all fine stones, proclaims one of Tutankhamun's inscriptions. I built new ships to ply the waters and covered them with gold so that they illuminated the Nile. Tutankhamun was one of 14 kings that comprised Egypt's 18th dynasty. In 1550 BC, its founder, Ahmose I, inaugurated the new kingdom and launched the greatest empire the world had ever seen. At its height, Egypt's sphere of influence would stretch as far north as Syria and as far south as the central Sudan. But before Amose's reign, there was no empire. For 100 years, Egypt had been ruled by foreigners. Originally from Canaan, these foreigners, known as the Hyksos, had established a power base in the Nile Delta, giving them a stranglehold on the lucrative Mediterranean trade routes. The Hyksos had an advantage: better military technology. A superior form of battle axe was designed for piercing. Their bows, a composite made of wood, sinew, and horn, sent arrows streaming over longer distances. But their most potent weapon was something new: mobility. With a horse-drawn chariot, the Hyksos could move fast and wield their arms with deadly force. All Egypt paid obeisance to the foreigners, but with increasing reluctance. In Thebes, a family of local rulers, styling themselves as the true kings of Egypt, eventually rebelled. One of them, King Sekenenre III, paid the ultimate price. Dr. Mohammed Saleh, the director of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, has grisly proof.
This is the mummy of Sekenenre Ta'a, who died in the battlefield against the Hyksos. And as we unwrapped his body, we found so many mutilations and cuts. And you can see that he died in agony. And the face had cuts which would not have been done except only by weapons brought by the Hyksos to Egypt for the first time.
One of the weapons that did the damage was the battle axe distinctive to the Hyksos, its long, narrow blade perfectly suited to piercing bone. Humiliated by the presence of foreign rulers on Egyptian soil, Sekenenre Ta'a had led the first open revolt against the Hyksos. After his death, his son, Kamose, took up the fight. Carved on a stela, a commemorative stone found in Thebes, is an account of the bitter hatred between Kamose and the king of the Hyksos, Ipepi. As mighty Amun endures, I will not leave you alone, the Egyptian promises his enemy. I will not let you tread the fields without being upon you. O wicked of heart, vile Asiatic, I shall drink the wine of your vineyard, lay waste your dwelling place, cut down your trees. The dwelling place of the Hyksos was a mighty fortress in the Nile Delta called Avaris. From there they ruled Egypt for 100 years. Then, like the tomb of Tutankhamun, Avaris vanished without a trace. For thousands of years, the Nile River coursed through Egypt before branching out into a series of tributaries that form the rich floodplain of the Nile Delta. Here, the Hyksos built their capital. But for over a century, its exact location remained one of the great mysteries of modern archaeology. Covered over by millennia of silt, Avaris virtually disappeared until 1975, when a team of Austrian archaeologists, led by Manfred Bitak of the University of Vienna, began investigating a site known as Tel el-Daba. Tel means mound, usually the site of an ancient settlement. Pottery recovered from hundreds of boreholes sunk into the Tel helped Bitak home in on Tel el-Daba as the site of ancient Avaris. To the trained eye, Avaris is clearly not Egyptian. Its dwellings and temples are similar to those found in ancient Canaan and Syria. Among the contents of the graves, weapons and pottery of Hyksos type have been found. But in the 1990s, Bitak made what may be the most important find of them all, the remains of a palatial fortress. Surrounded by a giant wall, its most prominent feature was a heavily fortified citadel, strategically located on a vanished branch of the Nile. Bitak believes this was the dwelling place of the Hyksos king, Ipepi. Kamoza had threatened to attack Avaris and drive out the Hyksos. Now, as he was about to make good on his word, Ipepi hatched a clever plan. In what is now the northern Sudan lay the kingdom of Kush, its capital, the city of Kerma. About 1555 BC, a messenger left Avaris and headed south across the desert towards Kerma, bent on a secret mission. But his journey would be interrupted. In 1991, John and Deborah Darnell of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago were exploring the desert a short distance northwest of ancient Thebes when they stumbled upon an ancient caravan road worn smooth by centuries of use. The road led them to a hill they call Jebel Jauti. What makes this desert cliff so unusual are the inscriptions. It's covered with graffiti.
This is probably one of the most lovely of the inscriptions we have here at Chaudi. It's a a little royal falcon wearing a double crown. And what's wonderful about this particular inscription is you can really get a feeling for how the artist selected the area in which he was going to make the inscription. There's this wonderful blush of salt coming out of the stone, and that little spot in the middle must have suggested the shape of the body of a falcon, because he chose just the right area to accentuate his carving. Also, we had a very difficult time when we were trying to make the original copy. Doing it from a right-handed position, it was almost impossible to complete. But we had a left-hander with us, and she had no problem making the inscription copy. So we assume that the original artist was all.
Chain of lookout posts manned by desert policemen. Today, what appears to be a pile of rubble was once a pair of towers, some 30 feet in height. The towers would play a key role in the war against
These are guarding the caravan tracks that go to Jebel Chauti, and we know that this area is at the border of Thebes, the northern border of the Theban province. And these towers appear then to have been in use around the time of Kamoza to guard the caravan tracks here and to be used as bases for the roving desert policemen who would be guarding the narrow door of the desert, as the Egyptians called it, this back door to Thebes.
For the Hyksos, the back door to Thebes was the road to disaster. Ipepi had hoped to defeat Kamoze by forging an alliance with the king of Kush and opening a second front on Egypt's southern border. But his plan was thwarted when his messenger was captured in the desert on his way to Kerma. Kamoze died before the Hyksos were finally ousted. The task would fall to his brother, Ahmose, the founder of the 18th dynasty. The first pharaoh to rule during the Age of Gold, Ahmose was bent on liberating Egypt. Determined to beat the enemy at his own game, Ahmose adopted some of the superior weapons of the Hyksos. Soon, horse-drawn chariots driven by Egyptians appeared on the battlefield. But the details of who exactly vanquished the Hyksos might have been lost in obscurity were it not for a remarkable set of inscriptions found near a tiny village called El-Kab in Upper Egypt. In an unabashed display of vanity, a soldier in the pharaoh's army, also named Ahmose, left his autobiography on the walls of his tomb. Vivian Davis, keeper of Egyptian antiquities at the British Museum, sees a man who not only rose from the ranks to become an admiral, but was highly decorated for his valor.
The highest accolade that could be bestowed upon one as a soldier in ancient Egypt was to be awarded the Gold of Honor by the king. This man was awarded the Gold of Honor 7 times. He must have been a military hero of his age. He's shown, in fact, wearing the Gold of Honor proudly here. These armlets made of solid gold.
Ahmose began his illustrious career at the Battle of Avaris in about 1530 BC.
Here, for example, there's an account of a skirmish near Avaris in the water. He made a capture here and was rewarded with his first Nebu Enkent, the Gold of Honor.
An armlet was awarded when an enemy was killed. I made a seizure and carried off a hand, Amamos declared. Lopping off a hand was Egypt's way of counting casualties. Live captives were considered booty. I brought from Avaris 1 man and 3 women. His Majesty gave them to me as slaves. But the tomb recorded more than the soldiers' personal triumphs.
But most crucially, the tomb contains the information Her Chak Chutwaret. Avaris was taken. This means that King Amamos had defeated the Hyksos.
The expulsion of the Hyksos reunited Egypt under a native king for the first time in over a century. But the king was not content. Wary of retaliation, he made 2 decisive moves. King Amamos marched his army across the desert and laid siege to the Hyksos stronghold at Sharoen in southern Canaan. Then he forged a powerful alliance. A bull leaper and a labyrinth are 2 of the most famous symbols in ancient mythology. They come from the palace of Knossos at Crete, the legendary home of King Minos and the fabled beast, the Minotaur. A powerful sea-going kingdom, the Minoans dominated the Aegean. Crete was a sprawling commercial center made rich by wine and olive oil, from which fleets of ships crisscrossed the Mediterranean. In 1991, while excavating a palace at Avaris built by King Amamos after the expulsion of the Hyksos, Manfred Bitak and his team made an astonishing discovery. They uncovered literally thousands of fragments of Minoan frescoes, the first ever found on Egyptian soil. Among them were pieces of a fresco strikingly similar to the one painted on the walls of the palace of Knossos at Crete.
To our amazement, we found fragments which fit together to a scene of bull leaping. The technique of this painting is particularly Minoan and are amazing to be found in Egypt, because this is not an Egyptian way of painting. Also, the motive of bull leaping so far has only been discovered in the palace of Knossos.
Bull leaping evokes physical challenge and man's dominance over animals. A sport of great ritual significance to the Minoans, it was closely associated with the Minoan royal court, while the maze and frieze patterns were symbolic of Minoan palatial architecture. The presence of such motifs on the walls of an Egyptian palace implies a close relationship existed between the 2 royal courts. But what kind of relationship was it? Bitak thinks the 2 powers struck a mutually advantageous bargain, cemented perhaps by a royal marriage. Even after his victory at Avaris, King Amamos still feared the return of the Hyksos, but an attack now could only come from the sea. The Minoans were the leading sea power of the time. By forging an alliance with them, Egypt would be defended. In exchange, the Minoans were generously rewarded. Their ships would return home laden with the legacy of the Age of Gold. Gold was the most sought-after commodity in the ancient world. For Egypt, possession of it was a priority, but the greatest reserves lay in Nubia. His northern borders secure, King Amamos now turns south to seek revenge on the Hyksos' old ally, the Kingdom of Kush. A rich and powerful empire, it stretched from Egypt's southern border several hundreds of miles into the Sudan. Its capital, Kerma, was the oldest and largest city in Africa outside Egypt. Today, Kerma is in ruins, but its massive temple is still largely intact. 3,500 feet square, it's known locally as the Defufa. Though stripped of its outer casing and gnarled by time, the Defufa still dominates the surrounding landscape. In 1977, Charles Bonnet, director of the Swiss archaeological mission in the Sudan, began exploring the Defufa as part of a plan to investigate Kerma. To the side, a single gateway opens onto a stairway leading to a small chamber, the temple's inner sanctum. Near an altar made of white marble, Bonnet found the bones of sheep and goats, suggesting it was used for the sacrifice of animals.
We are here in the middle of an enigmatic monument, the Defufa. This Defufa, the name itself is strange. It's a Nubian name, meaning an elevation done by men. Here, this altar is maybe the center of ceremonies, and we think that for offering, the priest killed some sheep on this stone.
From the chamber, another stairway leads to the roof, where ceremonies to the sun god were performed. Some 50 feet high, it commands a view of what was once a very impressive city. At its height in 1550 BC, Kerma would have been an awesome sight. A fortified wall 30 feet tall surrounded the homes and gardens of the nobility, the king's audience hall and palace, and the religious complex. Covered in white plaster with pylons over 65 feet tall, the Defufa was magnificent, even by Egyptian standards. Situated on the banks of the Nile, the main trade route running north to south, the city grew rich not only on gold, but also by controlling the flow of exotic goods: ivory, ebony, incense, wild animals, and slaves, from the heart of Africa to Egypt and beyond. In time, Kerma produced its own highly skilled craftsmen.
I'm particularly interested with this small object of ceramics, which looks very, very beautiful.
Well, you are right, because it is something unique. A view of the door of the ancient city of Kerma, about 4,000 years ago. We can see the shape of the door with the loopholes on the summit, because naturally all the city was fortified. And the strange thing is, after use...
Salah Ahmed, director of excavations of the Sudanese Antiquities Service, is even more impressed by the pottery. A distinctive black and red, and eggshell thin, it's one of the finest ceramics produced in the ancient world.
I think that the masterpiece is surely this bowl. And we found also gold, you know. We are in the country of the gold.
Oh, very interesting.
Everybody is thinking here that we look for gold only. And I am afraid to find too many pieces of gold. I will take it here.
One of the great mysteries of Kerma is how a kingdom with thousands of inhabitants could sustain itself in what looks like a barren desert. To find out, Derek Welsby of the British Museum and his team surveyed an area of 700 square miles south of the city, which were previously unexplored. There they discovered 400 ancient sites, most dating back to the Kerma period. When they were plotted on a map, they fell into a line along what turned out to be two old channels of the river, which have since dried up.
The banks are visible by the lines of vegetation on this side and this side, and the channel at this point, about 70 metres wide, is running almost due north. This discovery of these two channels of the Nile, as well as the channel that the present day stream flows in, gives some indication perhaps of the agricultural wealth of this area in the Kerma period.
With two more channels flowing through the Nile Valley, thousands of additional acres of fertile soil would have been available to the farmers of Kerma for growing crops.
Presumably this was all tied in with a network of supplying produce to the capital of Kerma itself, which lies some 55 kilometres north from here. And in many of these settlements we have large numbers of store buildings which may have been designed for the collection of this produce and for storing it before sending it on to the administrative centre in Kerma.
Derek Welsby made one more important discovery. Nature would play a cruel trick on the city of Kerma and the kingdom of Kush. Around 1500 BC, the two Nile channels began to dry up and the food supply began to diminish. Now, at the moment of crisis, a new, even more sinister threat loomed out of the north. The Egyptian campaign, first begun by King Amamos to subdue their southern neighbors, was now in its third decade. Lower Nubia had fallen years earlier with little resistance, but further into the country, opposition was stronger. The soldier Amamos, who fought so bravely at Avaris, had risen in the ranks. Officially titled Warrior of the Ruler, he now serves in the army of King Thutmose I. In about 1500 BC, the pharaoh sailed into the heartland of Kush, to the third cataract of the Nile for the final and decisive battle. A few miles north of Kerma, Thutmose engaged the enemy, led by the chief of the Nubians. His Majesty shot, and his first arrow pierced the chest of that foe, Amamos reported. Then the enemy turned to flee. A slaughter was made among them, their dependents carried off as living slaves. The arrow still in his chest, the Nubian chief was hung upside down from the prow of Thutmose's ship as a grim warning. Then the pharaoh sacked and burned the Kushite capital. The victory was later documented by an inscription carved on a huge rock at Tombos, not far from Kerma. He has overthrown the chief of the Nubians. None of them has survived. The Nubian archers are fallen in slaughter, are spread over the plains. Their entrails fill their valleys. Their blood pours down like rain. With the conquest of the Kushites, Egypt laid claim to the richest gold fields in the ancient world. Enormous quantities poured into the treasuries of the pharaohs, along with exotic goods from Africa. Tomb paintings show Nubians bringing tribute in the form of gold to Egypt. The gold was carefully weighed in the scales and registered by the scribes. Inscriptions from the time of Thutmose III, the grandson of the conqueror of Kush, record that during 3 separate years of his reign, over 9,000 debons of gold were imported from the mines of Nubia, the equivalent of nearly £2,000, worth millions of dollars today. Bent on annexing Nubia to its expanding empire, the Egyptians pursued a deliberate policy of assimilation. Brought to Egypt as hostages, the sons of Nubia's rulers were installed in the palace and educated along with the pharaoh's children. There they learned the Egyptian language, wore Egyptian clothes, and even took Egyptian names. Once indoctrinated, they returned home to serve in the colonial government. The most powerful official in Nubia was the Viceroy of Kush. His charge to keep Nubia's valuable resources flowing into Egypt was reflected in one of his titles, the Overseer of the Gold Lands. One of the most famous viceroys was Mose, who served for 30 years under King Amenhotep III from 1390 BC. A picture of him is carved on the back of the great rock at Tombos. The names of his master are enclosed in 2 ovals called cartouches. Under the cartouches are the figures of 2 captive Nubians, a symbol of Egyptian domination. Mose was rewarded for his services with a tomb at Thebes, which included 3 beautifully carved hard-stone sarcophagi. A remarkable burial for a commoner, it was a mark of the esteem in which he was held by the king. It was his master, Amenhotep III, the 9th pharaoh of the new kingdom, who would reap the greatest harvest of the Age of Gold. Known as Egypt's dazzling sun, by the time of his death in 1352 BC, Amenhotep was probably the richest man on earth. The opulence of his court was unrivaled in antiquity. During a reign that lasted almost 40 years, Amenhotep transformed the landscape of the Nile Valley. He built a magnificent new temple at Luxor, made major additions to the temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak, and erected hundreds of statues, including the Colossi of Memnon at Thebes. Abroad, Egypt's wealth was the envy of the Mediterranean world, and the pharaoh's prestige never higher. Foreign kings wrote him, pleading for gold. Great king, king of Egypt, my brother, gold in your country is like dust. One simply picks it up. Why are you so sparing of it? I am engaged in building a new palace. Send me as much gold as I need. But during the imperial age, more gold flowed into Egypt than out. It even filtered down to those who served the pharaoh. One of the greatest aspirations of the Egyptian elite was to own a fine tomb, a house for eternity, painted with colorful scenes. High on a hill on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes is the tomb of a royal butler named Suemnuet, who served his king Amenhotep II and was rewarded with gold. Egyptologist Betsy Bryan of Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, has figured out he was wealthy enough to hire a large gang of painters and apprentices to decorate his tomb.
Here in this corner, we have the work of a real master painter, a specialist who really didn't even need to use the grid that you find on the walls throughout the rest of the tomb. He was able to come here and design these royal statues without any sort of grid at all, using a tiny, tiny brush where he was able to draw in the king's body and outline it several different times, which you can see with your own eye, until he got the outline exactly the way he wanted it. And then he would fill in with layers of color in order to complete the statue. This one itself would have probably been finished with black to indicate the resurrection of the king, a black statue, whereas this one would have had yellow skin, and probably this one would have had red skin by the time he was finished. But using this technique without a grid is extremely difficult to get proportions, and yet this man, because he was such a specialist, was able to proportion these figures absolutely perfectly.
A master could paint a wall freehand. Apprentices followed grid lines to get the proper proportions. Even then, novices or veterans, some were more skilled than others.
In this back part of the tomb, we actually have the area where they used the artists who were probably the most poorly trained, maybe some of those who were just beginning apprentices, and maybe some of those who were in fact reaching the very end of their career. In particular, we have an artist that we sort of affectionately call Old Yeller, because he was the person who was working on only putting the yellow paint on this particular wall. And unfortunately, Old Yeller does not seem to have had the greatest eyesight. So if you look on any figure where there's yellow paint, he approached, and wherever there had been a completely finished outline, face has been outlined, the eyes have been detailed, Old Yeller just paints right on over the eye.
While apprentices practiced their craft on the elite and wealthy, only masters were allowed into the tombs of the pharaohs. The largest and finest in the Valley of the Kings belonged to Seti I. One of only a few tombs actually completed, it consists of several rooms connected by a series of descending passageways that lead to the burial chamber some 300 feet from the entrance. Hollowing out a tomb took an average of 2 years. Decorating it took even longer. Because of the enormous amount of labor and skill required, an elite corps of craftsmen were permanently assigned to building the royal tombs. A few miles from the Valley of the Kings is a walled village the ancient Egyptians called the Place of Truth. Now known as Deir El-Medina, the village housed stonemasons, sculptors, draftsmen, and carpenters, skills passed down from father to son. Unusually literate, the workmen kept written records on papyrus and bits of pottery and limestone called ostraca, of everything from the price of food to duty rosters. The records show they were an affluent community, as revealed in the size and quality of some of their tombs. But despite prosperity at home, storm clouds were on the horizon. With the death of Seti in 1279 BC, the gods that had blessed Egypt for so long finally turned their backs on the new kingdom. In the north, the Hittites were threatening Egypt's empire. In 1274 BC, Seti's successor, Ramesses II, met the enemy at Kadesh in Syria. Celebrated on Egyptian temple walls as a great victory for the new king, at best it was a stalemate that ended with history's first international peace treaty. The Battle of Kadesh was the beginning of the end of the imperial age. Ominously, the supply of gold from Nubia also began to dwindle. Climatic change had made the deserts more arid and more difficult to traverse. The last great pharaoh of the new kingdom, Ramesses III, could only manage an average annual donation of 9 deben to the temple of Karnak, a paltry sum compared to the huge amounts lavished by his predecessors. But some Egyptians found a ready-made source of gold. By night, workmen who had once faithfully served their pharaohs now plundered the royal tombs. This transcript of a court case records the astonishing confession of a stonemason named Amenhotep. We opened the outer and inner coffins and found the king's noble mummy. A large number of amulets and ornaments of gold were upon his neck. We stole many articles and divided them up amongst ourselves, 20 debens of gold for each man. Then we burned the mummy. Fearing for his safety even in death, the last king of the Age of Gold, Ramesses XI, left Thebes in 1070 BC without completing his tomb. No pharaoh would ever again be buried in the Valley of the Kings. Ironically, the greatest threat to the tombs came not from Thebes, but from the government of Egypt. Now in political and economic turmoil, central authority collapsed and the country split in two. With gold in short supply, the royal tombs offered an irresistible temptation. Under the pretext of protecting Egypt's heritage from robbers, the royal mummies were systematically removed from their tombs, stripped of their gold and other priceless treasures, then reburied in 2 secret caches. There they would remain for 3,000 years, until they were discovered in the late 19th century and their bodies taken to the Cairo Museum. Only one pharaoh escaped. Today, the forgotten tomb of Tutankhamun provides a tantalizing glimpse of Egypt's untold riches during its glittering Age of Gold.